Right, so straight off the bat, I just want to say that I've thought about making this video for an entire year, but I've actively avoided it because I just dread touching the subject of this game. Every single time I start writing a script or capturing footage, it becomes way too unfocused and it turns into a mishmash of conflicting ideas, concept and opinions, and wow, that actually sums the game up pretty well. You don't need to watch the rest of this video, you can turn it off, bye bye. Like TLDR, this game is fantastic in so many ways, but it has some deeply rooted issues that are impossible to summarise without boring both of us to death. Telling you why this game is a disappointment isn't impossible, but it does require over a decade's worth of context, insider knowledge into the company behind it and the nature of the engine the game was developed on, and knowing just how influential the first game was on internet culture and the gaming medium as a whole. I'm going to try my best to be unbiased here. At least in the beginning. I've genuinely debated whether or not I want to turn comments off on this video because I don't want to repeat myself. If I have an argument, I'll bring it up, and I'll bring up the counter to that argument, and the counter to that argument. It's no secret that I was a big fan of Frictional, and you could even argue this was a Frictional based channel, and because that's where most of you watching this video even found me. I think I'll keep comments off, not because I want to discourage discussion or because I can't handle criticism, but because I just don't care to hear what you think. Everything that could be said about this game has already been said, if not by me, by you, or the thousands of other retards on this fucking platform. It's clear that Rebirth's reception was divisive, yeah, we'll say that, but it's not a bad game by any means, and despite the mountain of problems that I have with it, I'd still recommend you buy it and play it. The horror is okay, the story is okay, the environments, music, sound effects, it's all okay. And if that's my biggest problem with it, then it's not much of a problem at all. I really, really like Amnesia Rebirth, and even though it took me months to come to that conclusion, I stick with it, and I will defend this game for what it tried to do. But what did it try to do? That's the question. Okay, let's start from the beginning. I'll try and be quick, and spoilers, I don't think that was needed to be said. Go buy and play literally all of Frictional's games. They go on sale for dirt cheap every week out of desperation, but they're all worth your time. Anyway, here we go. Amnesia The Dark Descent is a horror game released by Frictional Games in 2010. The company was on its last legs and needed this game to be something of a commercial success. The game was praised for its environments, story and soundtrack, but most prominently of all, its horror, and the way it weaponized players' fear against them. Dark Descent's way of scaring you wasn't through shocking scenes or jump scares, although both are present, but instead it centered its horror around morality and the human condition, and what length the person would go to save themselves. Daniel, the protagonist, discovers an alien artifact in Algeria and gets sent back to the London to find out what it is and why it's there. Turns out, it's haunted. Kinda. It's being protected by this otherworldly entity called the Guardian, the shadow of which is hunting Daniel throughout the game and the events prior. It manifests with these fleshy growths, and while the shadow itself can be said to be sentient, the Guardian no doubt definitely is. Everybody that Daniel consults regarding the artifact is killed, and he ends up at Brennenburg Castle under the wing of Alexander von Brennenburg, an alien who is exiled to Earth and has been trying for centuries to get back to his homeworld. Turns out, Uncle Al has been capturing, torturing and murdering innocent people, extracting the vitae from their agonized blood before feeding them a tonic that erases their memory so they can be used over and over again. Uncle Al tells Daniel that they're all criminals and deserve to be punished. And so Daniel begins torturing them, and even starts to revel in it, but Daniel quickly comes to his senses after he chases down and stabs a young girl to death. After which he drinks the same potion he's been feeding the prisoners to forget his shame, and he awakens at the entrance of Castle Brennenburg with no recollection of where he is or how he got there. It's up to you to keep him sane while you both learn about the castle, its history and inhabitants, while you question the actions of the person you're playing as. Is he still a good person? Can he be forgiven after he was manipulated? Does his revenge plot to kill Alexander redeem him for his crimes? How far would you go to save yourself? Who are you now, and who do you want to be? Skip ahead a little bit to Amnesia Justine. It's a short DLC story focusing on a woman named Justine, who tortures men and captures innocent people before using an amnesia potion on herself, running through chambers of men and monsters, deciding on who to save while trying to stay alive. It's very good. Now its sequel, Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, exists, and it's also really, really good. It might not be as gameplay heavy as the original, and the story might be a bit overzealous at times, but it's still interesting and is no less of an Amnesia game for its differences. However, we won't go into it right now as it's not too related to Dark Descent or Rebirth. It has its connections, but none of its necessary knowledge for understanding Rebirth's story. Although it's definitely worth pointing out now that we've entered a crossroads. Machine for Pigs became a talking point in the community. It was a game a lot of people were looking forward to, and they wanted it to be bigger and scarier than its older brother. 2010 was a completely different time on the internet, especially on YouTube. YouTube wasn't this mega corporation that rivaled traditional media outlets, it was a search engine with a handful of emerging personalities and uploaders. Gaming videos weren't popular, it was weird to make those videos. This was a time when playing video games got you bullied in school, when playing games got you labelled as a nerd.
And you don't want to be a nerd, do you, kid?
We paved the way for you fuckers. We suffered for you kids nowadays. Now instead of getting bullied by other kids for being gamers, you get bullied by the now adult crowd that moved out with it because we don't have fucking time anymore. Now we're working on games, or at least in fields related to it. From 2010 to 2012, Amnesia the Dark Descent and a small YouTube personality at the time both blew up and got more exposure than my skin to the fucking sun throughout the pandemic. It's inarguable that the Dark Descent became one of the most influential games of all time, for better or worse. That game and this studio, Frictional Games, set in motion a chain of events that, while being their greatest success, would ultimately be their own downfall, not just for future titles but for the entire company's reputation. A Machine for Pigs released in 2013, and guess what? It wasn't what people were expecting. It wasn't primarily made by Frictional Games themselves, the story and its ideas went to places further than its 14-year-old demographic could understand, and it flat out wasn't the sequel people wanted. While it wasn't a bad game, the expectations leading up to it were all but destroyed upon its release, and it left a bad taste in people's mouths. Which now brings us to the big boy. Amnesia Rebirth released in 2020 in an entirely new internet environment, a whole decade after its predecessor. The game was announced 9 months before its release, had about 4 trailers in the span of 6 weeks, to where it got shit on by a new crowd of gamers for its lackluster graphics, and then shit on by tech heads who argue that as technology gets better, graphics should too, and that developers are lazy for not evolving. It also got shit on by its own community for the integrity of its mapping and environmental detail, and then the company lost its community manager and had to scramble to find someone capable of handling release PR, all before release. On top of that, people were already disappointed with Machine for Pigs, so they didn't have high hopes for Rebirth from the get-go. Already there was quite a lot to worry about, and remember, people had essentially been waiting 10 years for this game, so expectations for it weren't easy to taper down. Frictional assumed that word of mouth would be strong enough on its own to sell the game, the groundbreaking Amnesia title striking piss in the pants of gamers worldwide. But unfortunately that's not the way the world works anymore, especially online. Nowadays, news is torn apart in seconds by anyone with an opinion and an internet connection, and within minutes, a writhing global ball of opinion is formed by thousands of elitist, echo chamber cultist fucks with nothing better to do than argue with people online, while shards and slivers of other opinions get weeded out and hide in the cracks of forums and direct messages. During a global pandemic when everybody was inside, this was only amplified, and an opinion was formed before the game even came out. Although again, not many people knew it was coming out, so its potential audience already didn't think highly of it. This wasn't helped by the amount of attention it got on release. Big gaming YouTuber PewDiePie had strayed away from gaming content and didn't care to be associated with the series because it reminds people of the rape jokes and N-words that are sprinkled in his earlier videos, which all upset Big Mummy YouTube and its legion of horny advertisers. Markiplier didn't play it because he was busy with Unus Annus and he just didn't care to finish it, stopping his playthrough because he ran into a bug and didn't want his audience to know he can just load a save from an hour earlier. The real reason he didn't finish it being the opinion ball I mentioned earlier that was kamikaze katamariing itself through his neighbourhood via the telephone wires. I don't know why Jacksepticeye didn't play it, probably because no one else was. John Wolf played it and thought what pretty much the rest of us did. That's all the gaming YouTubers I know. But as you can see, nobody rose to fame this time around, otherwise I'd know about it. So there was a reason this game belly flopped off a cliff, but it's describing it that's the tough part. The game came out to lots of positive reviews, but honestly I think it's because those articles and news sites knew that a name as prolific as Amnesia could bring some buzz to them if it blew up like it did in 2010. And that if they didn't review it, or God forbid didn't have positive things to say about it, that they'd be swarmed by fans and have their offices burned down. That and all of them were too scared to say no to the little indie company that once started a revolution in the gaming industry. So we'll just give them a little pat on the head and a gold star. That and we don't remember what they did anyway. Now I skimmed a lot of things here, but that's as concise as I can make it. This video is likely already 12 minutes long. Factoring in all of that, the changing marketplace, the new gaming environment, the rapidly fluctuating culture of the internet, the demands of new players and the reception of Frictional's prior games, Rebirth was, in my eyes, set to fail the moment it was announced. And it did! Upon release, the hype for the game quickly died down with a collective, "That's it?" The big Let's Players stopped giving it publicity and the bleeding, screaming mass of flesh that is Opinion Ball left such a bad smell in the air that the restaurant got closed down while the health inspectors started their shifts. Months went by without a single mention of sales from the devs when they'd always been open about them in the past because they were ashamed to admit that their latest release was a commercial flop. But finally, they said something. However, it might have been better for them to stay quiet. 5 months later, Frictional made a post saying that Rebirth hadn't actually turned them a profit yet, but instead of address the problems of their engine, storytelling or design choices, they proceeded to blame the audience for not understanding the higher level concepts and themes that their game was constantly hammering the player with. For the 17 people left following this company, that was the last straw. Frictional were unable to critically assess the major flaws in their product and instead waved a finger at the consumer and told them they were the problem. But what went wrong? Now we can finally get around to talking about Rebirth as a product. I'll catch you up in case you forgot. Fast forward from 1839, the year is 1937. French woman Tassie and her Algerian partner Salim get married behind the government's back and have a child together. Unfortunately, their child Alice is born with a genetic illness and passes away after only a few years. As the pair grieve, their boss doesn't want them to be away from each other, and he pulls some strings so that the couple can work together on a trip to an Algerian mine. Months have passed and Tassie is pregnant again. During the flight, their company-issued plane Cassandra crashes, and the crew is left stranded in the desert. A few of the crew members are dead, and Salim is gravely injured. He takes shelter in a cave with another survivor while the rest of the crew head out to search for help. Eventually, they come across a spirit in the desert. This spirit is the queen of another dimension and offers aid to the crew. She presents them with an amulet that opens a rift connecting the two dimensions together. The crew go through the portal to meet the queen, Empress Tihana, and learn that she is responsible for crashing the plane, using it as a means to get Tassie's unborn child. This child suffers the same affliction Alice had, but can be spared with the tools of this alien dimension. Tihana pleads with Tassie to stay in her tower to conceive the child, in return offering to save the remaining crew from the desert. Tassie, having lost a child before, refuses the deal, to which Tihana responds by punishing the crew, tricking them into drinking water that disfigures their bodies and curses them to become uncontrollable creatures. Time passes and we eventually wake up in the Cassandra as Tassie, who has little to no memory of who she is or how she got there. She finds Salim dead and remembers that she's pregnant. Tassie soon learns that the otherworldly dimension known as the Dark World has been destroyed by an unknown force, and that visiting it can manipulate time. Her pregnancy rapidly accelerates, and within mere hours she's giving birth to her second child, Amory. This child is stolen by Anton, the doctor who delivered it. He steals Tassie's amulet and uses it to open a portal to the Queen's tower. Anton is killed, Tassie unravels the story and is then reunited with her daughter. Now from here, the game has 3 endings, one of which having 2 alternate outcomes. And would you believe it, the best ending is the one where Tassie becomes a terrorist, murders her daughter and commits suicide. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. If we were going to discuss the tens of plot holes, logical fallacies, narrative conveniences, and sheer fucking coincidences that occur throughout the storyline, we'd be here for hours. And I don't want to be here for hours. People have already been here for hours. Just know that the story is riddled with mistakes and conveniences that you really need to suspend your disbelief for. There's also a bunch of faults with the environment design which are just really fucking amateur and honestly embarrassing, and another set of faults regarding the established timeline and lore of multiple characters in the franchise. Rest assured, if it's a mistake, I'm already aware of it. But let's talk about the meat. Most people are focused on their disappointment with the gameplay, what people were looking forward to the most. Specifically the enemies' design and how they and their environments are constructed. I counted 20 scripted monster encounters, give or take, not including Yasmin or Tihana. In areas with multiple encounters like the Ghoul Nest and Factory, I counted them individually, and I'm counting the Shadow and Nest chases as well. Compared to the Dark Descent, that's about half the amount. And while more doesn't necessarily equal better, both games handle enemy encounters differently. You can argue that they're handled better in Dark Descent or Rebirth. They both serve different purposes and they're there for different reasons. In the Dark Descent, an enemy spawns, you hide for 2 minutes, it goes away. There's only one monster in the game that doesn't despawn and you have to deal with him. Hiding is initially very tense and you're so focused on where the enemy is and the weird fucking noises it's making that the brain cooks up lots of unfortunate scenarios that all involve Daniel's intestines getting sucked out of his arse. In Rebirth, there are very few encounters that actually despawn, and only one optional encounter that mirrors anything we saw in the Dark Descent. Most enemies don't go away, and the player is constantly moving from either line of sight or line of smell. Now why doesn't this work psychologically? You don't get time to sit and be scared. The brain isn't given these moments to pause and imagine the creature, but instead you're forced to avoid it by holding down A or D while strafing around a very large box. There are no moments where it chases you screeching into a room, pounding at the door while you scramble to dive into a closet or assemble some barrels to hide behind. There are scarcely any hold your breath moments where it walks right past you and you pray for it not to turn around 270 degrees on the spot and start chasing you. There is no creeping dread. The enemies aren't very intimidating and are extremely easy to outrun, and they show up so infrequently that you forget they exist. Given the fact that Frictional also wanted to add some variety to the way the enemies are structured, they attempted to make them more unpredictable, but in-game that just led me to speculate where they thought a surprising encounter would happen, and because I was thinking about the game from their perspective, barely any of the encounters actually took me by surprise because I predicted them in their unpredictability. Another reason the monsters aren't as scary is because you see them enough times that the mystique is all but completely gone, and the brain has nothing else to panic over. They don't look inhuman enough to be unfamiliar, and they aren't uniquely disfigured to have any particular hunting strengths or weaknesses that the brain can construct a paranoia trap around. The only thing these enemies can do is smell you, but the stealth is so flat and unsatisfying that these characters just don't carry weight. The fact that they can all be outrun by a pregnant woman who just survived a plane crash should tell you that they're useless fucking hunters. But there's a reason they were designed like this, and indulge me while I tell you why it's a huge fucking waste of time. Frictional didn't want the player to get killed as it has story ramifications, but dying does so little to affect the story when the only ending it affects is the one that's the least important. Dying in Rebirth results in Tassie passing out and becoming a ghoul for a short period of time, and puts you one step closer to becoming a full-blown harvester. Now the reason that that's absolutely useless as a consequence for failure is because you either A, die in one of the endings, B, are forced to become a ghoul anyway while Amari is safe from you, or C, escape to France and have your daughter die, which is completely unrelated to Tassie becoming a monster in the first place. If we want to talk about the lore ramifications of this ending and why that's not a consequence, it's established that avoiding intense negative emotions repress the urge of the creature, and it's shown that Tassie is perfectly capable of avoiding enemies even in a severe ghoul state. With that, it's perfectly reasonable that Tassie would be able to survive as a harvester in France, and not damage Amory for the next 2 years before Amory's inevitable death. Without Amory, the game loses its narrative device, and the whole reason Tassie tried so hard to fight for her in the first place. After that, all France has to do is worry about one random creature attacking a small amount of people. If Tassie did turn, she'd be killed within a day or two by the French military. So becoming a harvester upon death, while it raises some inherently interesting questions, is a completely useless gameplay gimmick that affects absolutely nothing in the minutiae of the continuing lore of the one in-game ending that it actually affects. Realising this, you then see that one of the biggest questions being asked throughout most of the game is made completely redundant, and by doing so it renders practically every gameplay mechanic useless. Why should you need to protect Amory if nothing is ever going to hurt her and she's just going to die anyway? Why should you calm yourself down if turning into a ghoul affects nothing in Tassie's future? Why should we question if Tassie will be a suitable mother to her child if we know she can control herself around her? Remember, Tassie isn't on any time limit. If you die a bunch of times, her face gets a little fucked up, yeah, but then again, she'd be able to survive in France and not go berserk. If you don't die at all, she's not panicked or expressing pain of a growing rage at the continued exposure to the Queen's curse. Unless you want to say that Tihana has a panic button that would immediately cause Tassie to turn into a ghoul before Amory dies, where Tassie could then endanger Amory's life, but there's no evidence to suggest that Tihana's capable of that. You could argue that Amory's eventual death would cause Tassie to lose control, but again we talked about why that doesn't matter when the game's narrative device is defunct. Overall, the gameplay consequence not only renders the death mechanic useless, but also the soothe baby mechanic. Now on the subject of making mechanics useless, let's talk about adventure mode. Hi, we're Frictional Games, most known for making what's regarded as one of the scariest games of all time. Now play the sequel with absolutely all of the horror completely removed. Yeah, that just doesn't sound right. So what does Adventure Mode even do? Adventure Mode disables fear from rising, removes enemies' ability of attacking Tassie, and strips away the atmospheric environmental lighting, making maps look like watercolour paintings that you'd see at a car boot sale in fucking Shropshire. Now the reason this is completely fucking brain-dead to me is 1, the game really isn't that scary anyway, 2, it's almost impossible to get caught by an enemy unless you've never played a video game before, and 3, removing the enemies completely takes away not only Tassie's fear of getting captured, but it also removes the parallel of Tassie understanding what they are, what they can do, and what she will become if she doesn't avoid them. By removing the already meagre gameplay consequences, you've also removed the narrative consequences as well, when those narrative consequences are supposed to be the entire fucking point about Tassie's struggle against the curse and her willingness to survive. How anyone thought that was a good idea is beyond me. Frictional even stated in an interview that a safe mode like playthrough wouldn't work because of how relevant the enemies were to the plot and the environment. So this tells us that they knew it was a bad idea but did it anyway, in an attempt to square off the story-driven consumers who want to sink into a story game because it wasn't making them enough money on release. But adventure mode isn't the way the game is supposed to be experienced, because it nullifies everything the mechanics and the story are trying to build. So again, it doesn't work for a new consumer base. This is why Rebirth is so flawed. It doesn't know what it wants to be. It doesn't commit to the horror, it doesn't commit to the story, it tries to mesh everything together, and because of that, the current events feel watered down while the overarching narrative gets dragged on and on. Do you understand why that's frustrating to the crowd that was expecting Rebirth? They weren't in it all for the scares, because people loved Soma, and Soma was a horror masterpiece of storytelling and environmental design. All people wanted was a cohesive mix of story and gameplay, but both of those elements trip and stumble over each other while a team of old and new developers try to pull the ropes to tie the knot. The friction causes the rope to set fire, and everybody's hands get burned. Alright, while I'm here, how did Tassie end up on the plane? We see a shot of Cassandra's exterior as a portal location in the orb's reflection, implying Tihana can send us there, but then how did Tassie end up in the plane if the handle was broken? Did she lock herself away and then tear the handle off, knowing what she was becoming? Okay, actually that makes a lot of sense. But why should I be guessing these things when you're supposed to use in-game details to hint at the correct scenario? And how does the Dark World affect Tassie's pregnancy? It's told that the Dark World's interpretation of time is different from our dimensional understanding of it, but then how does it move along Tassie's pregnancy without escalating the human dimension of time? Are both flows of time simultaneous, or does she just zap from one dimensional time to the other? If that's the case, then how is the pregnancy only accelerating after she leaves the Dark World when it should be doing the opposite? If the flow of time is simultaneous, then is she just aging faster in the dark dimension? If so, why hasn't Professor Herbert's corpse degraded any more than it currently has, considering he's been there for a century? And if not, are the Doctor and Yasmin just waiting for months for Tassie to appear outside of these dimensions? Why is there a portal conveniently connected to Oh, it's so that the crew could return home if they accepted the Queen's bargain? That makes sense. I thought it was just a massive coincidence, but I guess that's a good reason. Okay, so I just explained away the Tassie on a plane and Portal to France situation with plausible theories, but it was left so vague that the majority of the community thought it was a plot hole for an entire year. So again, why should I be guessing some of the most trivial things when you're supposed to telegraph that to the player? I get obfuscating important lore and story details for dramatic reveals, but literally everybody who played this game hasn't figured out some of these smaller things yet, and we still don't have any clues to if there's actual in-game explanations for these things. Okay, then why is the Queen still being kept alive if she has no kingdom left to rule over? Has the Queen just been conveniently waiting for decades for a baby with an incurable disease to enter her vicinity? How has nobody in the nearby villages for decades had a baby with birth defects that she wouldn't be able to acquire? To that end, why couldn't she just kidnap a healthy human baby from one of the villages? It just so happened that Tassie, a pregnant woman struggling with the loss of another child, managed to fly across the fucking spot where she is. How have the Gauls in the fort and cistern not attacked and killed neighbouring villages in Algeria if the French troops have been dead there for 8 years before Rebirth takes place, as evidenced by their notes in the barracks? How have those corpses not decomposed yet, and how are the Gauls not dead from starvation if they haven't found another food source? Why is Tassie not the slightest bit angry at the Queen for cursing her and killing her entire crew? Tassie was abused, betrayed, lied to, and outright almost murdered tens of times by the Queen's subjects, yet she doesn't question that when facing Tihana. How does the Vitae extracted from agonized humans keep an alien queen alive? And how could that same tincture be used to treat and sustain a human child? Who is Tassie's father? He's hinted at having a bigger role in the story, but why was it cut? Who is the man in the fort that had a connection to Tassie's father, Victor, implying it's the same Victor? Was Victor have supposed to given her the amulet as implied in a flashback? And if that's not the same amulet, then why would the game still include a majorly confusing red herring? Hypothetically speaking, if Tassie's father was somehow related to Brennenberg, then it could make sense that he would possess a Traveler's Amulet to give to Tassie, and it would then make sense that the child she bears with his DNA can be cured with the same magic that's curing one of his own kind in the Dark World. So is Tassie's father related to Alexander or Daniel or someone related to this other world? Why is this also underdeveloped and vague? Why have some people in the fanbase taken to criticising others' complaints about this game when it's a direct sequel and comparisons abound, if not encouraged to be made? Why have some people in this community taken it upon themselves to fix up the game, removing the jank and making it more cohesive when that was your job for 5 years? And my biggest complaint is, why did this game repeatedly violate the standards and philosophies that Frictional have been trying to uphold in their titles since the studio's conception? The overabundance of unavoidable hint text, the stop and start gameplay with obtrusive dialogue and flashbacks, the inclusion of forced quick-time events that break the immersion, and the fucking jump scares. The list goes on and fucking on. This fucking game was supposed to be the payoff from a decade's worth of technical knowledge, immersive storytelling, and atmospheric game design. So please tell me, why can I pull up the inventory and use it to negate taking fall damage? Have you not coded a fucking inventory before? Why are things as embarrassingly amateur as that present in your newest products when you've already made these things in the same engine without these flaws? How do things like that pass any amount of QA testing? Why didn't you market your fucking game properly when you have the experience to sell a commercial hit? Why are you hiring people who don't have experience with your very flawed HBL engine when you could just migrate to a new engine they all know and work 10 times faster? You've used the same engine since 2006 and people are noticing its restrictions. If you didn't invest so much money and time into it in the first place, you wouldn't be out of pocket when you inevitably do migrate to a new, more capable engine. Why have some members of the community felt the need to take it upon themselves to make a mod to fix all of the issues you littered the game in its coding with? And one more question, why am I so angry about all of this? It's because I care. Your community cares, Frictional. You're small enough that we both see what the other is doing, but your consumers are not getting the respect they deserve. You've made some incredible fucking things and your community used to be so passionate about your games and their stories. But outside of your games you keep letting it down. You never write, you never call, we don't hear from you, it's just not the same anymore, bring back Jens. But, all the negativity aside, I want to keep playing. My favourite thing about a Frictional game is my curiosity. Sit me in front of any one of your titles, Overture, Black Plague, Requiem, Dark Descent, Justine, Machine for Pigs, Soma, Rebirth, hell even Unbirth, and I'll just sit and experience. I could be walking around an abandoned research station in Greenland, picking up hard hats and throwing them at piles of rocks, and I would enjoy that. I could be in a gothic Prussian castle, picking up little statues and throwing them out of windows, and I would enjoy that too. I could be walking around on the ocean floor looking at this dumb robot thing fly around and bump into shit, or I could be looking at random pots and goblets in the desert and enjoy that too. Existing in a Frictional game for me is something special. It's a soft, autonomous piece where I just wander and stare and examine, quietly and patiently enjoying my time just listening to the interesting music and clinky sounds while I discover something new. I hope that childlike sense of perception and exploration stays in your future games, and I hope you're actually able to make future games. I know you feel pressure as a developer when the industry is moving as fast as it is, and I really appreciate that you try to make your latest game something wholly unique to the ones that came before it. As many problems as I have with Rebirth, and as disappointing as it was for me at first, not as a sequel but a standalone game, I still really enjoy it. Like I said, conceptually this game is one of the scariest games and stories that comes to mind. But in-game, it never has the same emotional effect. Rebirth feels like it's missing something, like it's not the game it was meant to be. It just feels off and nobody knows what it is. But the thought of it, being an injured pregnant woman alone and lost in the desert, humming lullabies and whispering dreams to her unborn child to keep herself sane whilst holding in tears as a groaning creature limps past her, that's fucking scary. And that pure human resilience is such a powerful and beautiful image. People have argued that giving the role of a pregnant woman to a male-dominated demographic of gamers was a bad idea for immersion, but evidently it worked to some degree as men were affected by this game just as much as women were. I think Rebirth was a really interesting evolution for the studio, and while it wasn't the game I thought it was going to be, I still appreciate the amount of work that went in. This game was nothing short of ambitious, but ambition can be overwhelming, and you can really feel it being pulled in so many different directions by so many different heads. It's almost like the Turngate speech in Black Plague predicted this game's development. The most interesting thing about Rebirth is that I feel like it's the wrong medium, like it would work better as a book or a short series. I just want to quickly say as well before someone tells me my own opinion, I didn't want Rebirth to be another Dark Descent. I wanted it to be faithful to the lore and themes of the franchise, and I wanted it to be a more focused and personal experience. Instead, it just felt like an attempt at broad appeal, trying to satiate horror junkies and scaredy cats at the same time, but ultimately not pleasing the crowd. All in all, it's not a bad game by any means. The environments are well realised and detailed, the voice acting is incredible, the music is great, and the story is genuinely heartbreaking. Replaying it a year later and accepting it for what it is has helped me see it in a new light. It's a labour of love, and it's clear that a lot of effort went into the game, regardless if I think it went to the right places or not. It definitely has its flaws, but so does every game, so I can't fault it for what it tried to deliver. It's good to remember that everybody benefited from this. Consumers got reminded not to let expectations dictate the quality of a product before its release, Frictional got to experiment and make a creative product they were passionate about, and also got a better understanding of the current wants and needs of their community and the gaming marketplace as a whole in the process. Needless to say, you've got a lot of eyes on you now. Hopefully we'll get to see you before 2025. Happy anniversary to Rebirth. You're one of the most original and interesting games I've ever played, and I hope you finally made budget. Okay, that's done. I don't need to think about this dumb video anymore.